A soldier picks up his radio. His hands are shaking. Around him, 3 tanks are on fire. His friends are screaming. And he says 7 words that will stop an entire army in its tracks. "We are dying here. Send everything." That transmission came in at 9:47 in the morning. By midnight, 350 soldiers were dead. Hundreds more were bleeding out in basements, waiting for helicopters that couldn't land. And an operation that generals had promised would be over in 3 days had turned into the worst military catastrophe Israel had seen in over 50 years. But here's what nobody is talking about. The thing that truly paralyzed this army wasn't the enemy's weapons, it wasn't the terrain, it wasn't even the casualties. It was one assumption, one single assumption made in a conference room weeks earlier. And I'm going to tell you exactly what that assumption was at the very end of this video. Because once you hear it, everything about this story changes completely. Stay with me. This is the full story of March 28th, 2026. Rewind to early March. Israel's northern border had been a slow-burning nightmare for months. Since January, Hezbollah had fired rockets that killed 89 Israeli civilians. Over 200,000 people had packed their things and fled their homes. Entire towns in northern Israel were ghost towns. The Israeli Air Force had been hitting Hezbollah positions since February: rocket launchers, weapons depots, command centers. But here's the problem. Intelligence reports were coming back saying Hezbollah still had approximately 80,000 rockets, still had sophisticated anti-tank weapons, still had fortified positions built specifically to stop an Israeli ground invasion. Some military commanders looked at those reports and said, "Do not go in on the ground. The cost will be catastrophic." But on March 25th, a rocket barrage hit Haifa. 23 people died. And when 23 people die in a single attack, the political pressure becomes a force of its own. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave the order. The operation was called Second Shield. The plan was clean, fast, and confident. 3 divisions, 45,000 troops, 600 tanks, 14 simultaneous breaches across the border at 4:30 in the morning. The objective? Push 30 kilometers into southern Lebanon, destroy Hezbollah infrastructure, establish a security zone, and be home in 3 to 5 days. 3 to 5 days. Commanders were told Hezbollah had around 5,000 fighters in the invasion zone. Airstrikes had already softened their positions. Israeli firepower and training would overwhelm whatever resistance remained. The plan was approved, the soldiers were briefed, and in the early hours of March 28th, 45,000 young men and women crossed into Lebanon, believing they were walking into a difficult but manageable operation. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The first 2 hours felt like a victory. By 6 a.m., Israeli units had pushed 3 to 5 kilometers into Lebanese territory. Commanders were reporting objectives achieved ahead of schedule. The mood at Northern Command headquarters was actually optimistic. Then, at 6:47 a.m., the ground swallowed 3 tanks whole. A company from the 36th Division was moving through agricultural land south of Maroun al-Ras when they drove over 500 kilograms of explosives buried beneath a dirt road. 3 Merkava tanks and 2 armored personnel carriers were destroyed instantly. 19 soldiers died in the first second. Before survivors could even process what happened, Hezbollah fighters appeared from positions that weren't on any Israeli map and opened fire. That company called for support. Artillery responded, but the Hezbollah fighters had already disappeared into tunnels. Tunnels that intelligence had either missed entirely or dramatically underestimated. 34 casualties, and the company was forced to retreat, leaving damaged vehicles behind. Now here's where it gets truly terrifying, because that wasn't a one-off ambush. That was the pattern, everywhere, all at once. Anti-tank teams with Russian Kornet missiles were engaging Israeli armor from concealed positions, firing and vanishing before Israel could respond. Snipers were targeting officers and radio operators specifically, cutting the head off units in the middle of battle. And IEDs were everywhere. Simple ones, sophisticated ones, pressure plates under rubble, infrared sensors in doorways. Every road was a potential grave. The terrain was doing Hezbollah's work for them. Southern Lebanon is hills, valleys, olive groves, and stone buildings, perfect cover for defenders, a nightmare for armored columns designed for open desert warfare. Israeli tanks couldn't maneuver, air support couldn't fire without positive identification, and Hezbollah fighters wore no uniforms and moved through civilian areas. By 9 a.m., Northern Command was drowning in casualty reports. Every single division was in trouble. The commander of Northern Command, Major General Golan, made a decision: commit the reserves, push more forces in. The doctrine said maintain momentum. The confidence said more troops equals more firepower equals problem solved. But more troops just meant more soldiers walking into the same ambushes. The battle for Bint Jibel became the bloodiest point of the entire day. The Golani Brigade had pushed into this town from 3 directions, and Hezbollah had spent years turning it into a trap. Buildings reinforced with concrete and steel, underground bunkers connected by tunnels, weapons cached in every third structure. Golani soldiers entering the outskirts at 10 a.m. were hit immediately. Anti-tank missiles taking out lead vehicles, machine guns sweeping streets, snipers picking off anyone who dismounted. And when engineers tried to blow holes through walls to create covered routes, IEDs hidden inside the walls killed the teams doing the breaching. By noon, the Golani Brigade had moved less than 300 meters inside the town. 67 casualties, 23 dead. One battalion commander got on the radio to brigade headquarters and said something that nobody wanted to hear. "We're in knife fight range. Every building is defended. Casualties are mounting faster than we can evacuate. Without reinforcement and a complete change of tactics, we cannot achieve the objective." And those words were being echoed across the entire front. Field hospitals just inside the Lebanese border were overwhelmed, surgeons operating as fast as they could, helicopters evacuating the most critical cases, but landing zones near the fighting were taking RPG fire, so pilots had to come in fast, grab the wounded, and leave immediately. Some soldiers waited hours for evacuation, while medics worked on them in basements under fire. One combat medic, Staff Sergeant Jonathan Klein, described treating a soldier who had lost both legs. He said, "We lost patients not because medicine failed, but because we couldn't get them to surgery fast enough." At 4 p.m., General Golan called an emergency conference with all division commanders. The reports were all the same: unsustainable casualties, ammunition running out faster than planned, air support struggling. And then came the number that changed everything. Intelligence had estimated 5,000 Hezbollah fighters in the invasion zone. Israeli commanders were now estimating 15,000 to 20,000. Hezbollah hadn't just been waiting, they had reinforced, heavily, quietly. While Israel was watching from the air, Hezbollah had been moving an army underground. Golan ordered all units to stop advancing and consolidate. But stopping didn't mean surviving, because the moment Hezbollah sensed the advance had halted, they attacked. At 5:30 p.m., Hezbollah launched a coordinated assault on Israeli positions near Maroun el-Ras. Mortars disabled vehicles. Fighters advanced through ravines and tree lines. Kornet missiles hit anything that moved. Danger-close artillery was called in, shells landing 50 meters from Israeli soldiers just to break the assault. Attack helicopters circled overhead, but couldn't fire in the fading light without risking hitting their own people. 90 minutes of hell. When Hezbollah pulled back, that single position had lost another 31 soldiers in 90 minutes. By midnight, the preliminary casualty count reached 350 dead, 800 wounded. And somewhere in Lebanon, in a partially collapsed building, a lieutenant named David Levy sat with 14 soldiers, 3 of them wounded and unable to be evacuated. No food, limited ammunition, and Hezbollah firing RPGs at their building every hour just to remind them they were surrounded. He said later, the question wasn't whether we would complete the mission, the question was whether we would survive until morning. Now, I promised you something at the start of this video. I told you this entire catastrophe came down to one assumption, one single thing decided in a conference room weeks before a single soldier crossed that border. Here it is. Israeli planners assumed that Hezbollah would fight like a conventional enemy, that they would resist from visible positions, absorb Israeli firepower, and eventually break. The entire plan was built on that assumption. The timeline, the force structure, the casualty projections, the political promises. But Hezbollah had spent 20 years studying exactly how Israel fights. They watched 1982. They watched 2006. They cataloged every Israeli tactic, every weakness in armored operations, every vulnerability in urban warfare doctrine. And they built a military designed from the ground up, not to fight Israel, but to survive Israel, and then destroy it from the inside out. The tunnels weren't a surprise they stumbled upon. They were the strategy. Hezbollah never intended to hold ground. They intended to make every meter of ground cost Israel more than it could afford to pay. The IEDs weren't improvised. They were engineered, specifically calibrated to defeat Merkava tank armor, placed months in advance by fighters who had memorized every road Israeli forces were likely to use. The 5,000 fighter estimate that intelligence provided, that number was wrong not because of a technical failure. It was wrong because Hezbollah deliberately fed that number into Israeli intelligence channels. They wanted Israel to underestimate them. They wanted Israel to come in fast and confident and light. And when Israel did exactly that, Hezbollah was ready. 350 soldiers died on March 28, 2026, more than in the entire 2006 Lebanon War, in one day. And the most painful part of this story isn't the casualties, it isn't the political fallout, it isn't even the soldiers trapped in basements waiting for helicopters. It's this. Every single warning sign was there. The intelligence gaps were flagged. The tunnel networks had been partially identified. Some commanders had said out loud, "Do not go in. The cost will be catastrophic." But a rocket killed 23 people in Haifa, and political pressure became louder than military caution. History is full of moments where the decision to act was made not because the conditions were right, but because the pressure to be seen acting became unbearable. And the soldiers who pay the price for those decisions are never the ones sitting in the conference room. March 28, 2026 will be studied in military academies for decades, not as a story about Hezbollah's strength, but as a warning about what happens when confidence replaces analysis, when timelines are built on assumptions instead of intelligence, and when the costs of war are calculated by people who will never have to carry a wounded friend through a building that's on fire. If this story affected you, share it, because the best way to honor the soldiers who died that day is to make sure the people making these decisions are never allowed to forget what those decisions actually cost. I'll see you in the next one.